So the topic itself, I think, deserves very little motivation, as Roger's presentation was very clear. For about half of the countries in the region, those countries have become vulnerable one way or another to fluctuation in commodity prices. However, to what extent they would be affected remains debated, and so this chapter tries to shed light on that topic. And I'll try to respond to those questions through three different aspects. First, I'll look and show how much that dependency to commodities has changed over time and how it compares to other regions in the world. The second question I'll try to answer is, to what extent those fluctuations affect macroeconomic performance in the region, and in particular by looking at past episodes of commodity price decline, try to draw some lessons about how the region will be affected in the next few years. And then, building on those lessons, I'll also try to draw some lessons about how those countries can best react with policies. So one element that's very important to realize is that unlike many other regions in the world, like Asia or Latin America, over the last 30 years, the region has actually become more and not less dependent on commodity. Here, if you look at the net commodity exports for the region as a whole, it has grown from about 2% of GDP in the 80s to about 6% nowadays. And not too surprisingly, this is affecting more oil exporters in the region. If you look here on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you can see that net exports for countries such as Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and the Congo, the Republic of Congo, net exports for those countries, net exports of oil corresponds to about 45 to 85% of GDP. And then when you look at metal exporters, which with the 8 oil exporters account for about 20 countries out of the 45 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, those countries tend to have slightly less net exports, but still fairly significant, from about 10 to 30% of GDP. So those are countries, to name the largest, like Zambia, Ghana, or South Africa. Now, the first step to go and understand how and the magnitude of the impact of commodity price fluctuations on those economies, the first step is to understand how the terms of trade of these countries are affected. And by terms of trade, I mean the fluctuation of net export income for those countries in percent of GDP. So here you see those fluctuations over a period of 45 years, and especially since the turn of the century, what we see is that the oil exporters have experienced very dramatic fluctuations of their terms of trade. In fact, they experienced a very dramatic increase of terms of trade from 2000 to 2014, but also an equally dramatic decline since the mid-2014. And this decline has been much larger, both compared to oil exporters outside the region and to other commodity exporters in the region. The solid green line shows you the terms of trade fluctuations for the metal exporters in sub-Saharan Africa, and as you can see, it's much more stable than what we see for the solid red line, which is the sub-Saharan African oil exporters. Now, looking at a little bit more in detail at every country circumstances, what we see here again is that those terms of trade have declined the most for the countries that are the most, whose production and production is so much more concentrated into oil. So again, Gabon, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Angola have seen terms of trade decline ranging from 25 to 45% of GDP. This is an enormous, I mean, if you think of it, those countries have lost about 20% of GDP of export income in a matter of 18 months. Those changes, again, are more muted for metal exporters, but are still being quite significant for countries like Zambia, Sierra Leone, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which have lost about 5 to 10% of terms of trade over that period, owing to the sharp decline both of copper and iron ore prices. So now, given those very sharp fluctuations, it's legitimate to ask how those countries have been affected in terms of macroeconomic outcome. So at first sight, if you look at the past and the period of very strong increase in terms of trade, the correlation between those very large increase in terms of trade and the growth rate seems to be only apparent for oil exporters. But it doesn't mean that for the metal exporters, which here are shown as those green triangles, that the decline of prices that they've experienced since 2011, 2012 would not have affected their economy. And the reason is that for those countries, you have very discrete moments that can affect the economy very strongly. And this is when there's a decision to actually close mines, where with very negative impact on jobs and activity. And we've actually seen that happening recently in countries such as Zambia, South Africa, Sierra Leone, or DRC, to name a few. And this can actually introduce some non-linearity and very strong impact on the economy. So one first way of looking at the impact those terms of trade shocks have on those economies is to do some event studies. So basically look at past shocks of similar magnitude and how they have tended to affect the economy. So that's what we show here, where we look at the growth rates of those economies prior and after commodity price shocks that happened in the past. So in general, we find that sub-Saharan African countries tend to see a decline of about 1% of GDP in terms of growth when those happens, which is quite similar to what we see in other emerging and developing countries around the world. So not too much of an effect, or not too much more of an effect than elsewhere in the world. However, for sub-Saharan Africa oil exporters, the situation is very different. And in fact, we find a much larger impact on the economy, at more or less a decline of 3 percentage points of growth after commodity shocks. So a very large impact. And actually, when we look at what has happened already since 2014, sub-Saharan Africa oil exporters grew by about 6% in 2014. That growth rate was only 2.6% in 2015. So this is very much the order of magnitude that we've already seen this current oil price shock. And those very large impact on growth are also very apparent on other macroeconomic variables. As you can see here, in those episodes, the very substantial current account surplus that those countries have very quickly turn into a deficit. Same for the fiscal balance, and we also see a very large drawdown on reserves. Now, one might argue that the event study doesn't take into account other elements that could affect growth for the commodity exporters at the time of a price slump. For example, the growth rate of the trade partners or political factor domestically. So to complement the event study, we've also done some econometric analysis that control for this other exogenous factors. And these analyses pretty much confirm what we find and the very strong headwinds of oil exporters. If you look on the left-hand side, basically what this analysis shows is that for 1% decline in the commodity in terms of trade shock, countries in sub-Saharan Africa tend to have a cumulative impact of loss of GDP of about 0.75 percentage point. So knowing that oil exporters have experienced a 20% decline in terms of trade, this also corresponds to a declining growth of about 3 to 3.5% of GDP for 4 consecutive years for the region. So again, very much in line with the order of magnitude we've seen already, but what this study shows is that the effect is very protracted. The negative impact peaks after 4 years. So it means that those countries are not yet out of the woods, even if oil price has stabilized or tended to even rebound a little bit. So given that this macroeconomic impact is very large, especially for the oil exporters in the region, what is our recommendation and how best can the country cope with this shock? So the event study already provides some glimpse about what the best policy response can be. On the left-hand side, what you can see is that when you look at the countries that have coped the best in the past episodes, what we see is that countries that had a more flexible exchange rate have tended to be more resilient. Similarly, countries that entered the period of shock with a lower level of public debt have also tended to be more resilient. So to complement this first analysis, we also conducted a more comprehensive econometric analysis trying to identify the factor that determine the difference in growth before and after the shock. So here, I know it's a little complicated and I'll walk you through the results, but basically the dependent variable is the difference in growth rate after and before the shock. So basically, any significant positive variable here or coefficient here will indicate that the variable in question, the policy in question, would help mitigate the impact of the shock. So what are the results? Well, the first thing we find, and complementing what Roger said and what the event study seemed to suggest, is that indeed a flexible exchange rate tend to help countries absorb the shock and weather the shock. It also shows that the level of depreciation also helps. This result is that basically for every 10% depreciation over a period of 2 years after the shock, tend to mitigate the loss in GDP by about 1.25% of GDP. However, what's important to notice is that for countries that experience a very large depreciation, what we call the exchange rate collapse, that tends to increase the negative impact on growth. And our interpretation of that result is that when countries tend to delay the exchange rate adjustment, this tends to have negative consequences because it gives time for imbalances to build, so much so that by the time the exchange rate depreciation happens, it cannot help anymore to absorb the shock. And in particular, we looked at the country in the sample that experienced that type of exchange rate collapse. And in 3/4 of the sample, those were countries that up to then had a fixed or a pegged exchange rate regime, and it had come to a point where they could not sustain anymore, and then that led to the exchange rate collapse. So basically the bottom line and the confirmation here of our prior is that the exchange rate where it's available can be a tool to absorb the shock, but it should not be delayed. Now, turning to the fiscal policy, we do find that countercyclical fiscal policy can help. And indeed, here, when you look at the growth of government consumption after the shock, with more growth, you actually found less negative impact on the economy. However, and this is a big however, this effect disappears when the stock of debt entering into the shock is too high. Here we have this, when the external debt is above 40%, we find that positive impact of counter-cyclical fiscal policy disappears. So it means that up to when you have buffers, you can use them, but if you don't have fiscal space, then increasing government consumption can actually be counterproductive. So what does that mean for sub-Saharan African countries and commodity exporters at this juncture? So as I said, the first takeaway is that indeed the exchange rate adjustment should not be delayed. The other element is that up to now, between mid-2014 and now, as Roger's presentation showed, countries have used all of their buffers. They've let the fiscal deficit widen, public debt has increased, and basically we're getting very close to that threshold where fiscal policy and expansionary fiscal policy loses its power. So that's one reason why we feel that now fiscal adjustment is really called for, especially for the countries that do not have the exchange rate tool, such as the Central African Monetary Union, the CEMAC. That said, it doesn't have to be through a very drastic adjustment that really kills growth. And in particular, we see two avenues where this can be done, minimizing the negative impact on growth. The first one is really to work at domestic revenue mobilization, like Roger was saying, increasing the tax base from the non-commodity sectors as a sustainable source of fiscal space. The other one is to really work more closely at prioritizing spending. In particular, there's one element where we feel that there's still room for some commodity exporters, which is in the area of fuel subsidies, which still eat some fiscal space in some countries. As Roger also said, beyond the macro policy response, this is also an opportunity to reinvigorate the diversification agenda for those countries. And I won't say more because Roger already elaborated quite a bit. Let me just say one thing is that, in a sense, this may sound very bleak and really send a signal that especially oil exporters are going to continue to be hit very much. But I think one positive takeaway from this work is that policy really matter, and policies have a role to play for countries to adjust to this very rough patch. But now is the time to put these policies in place. Otherwise, the adjustment run the risk of being disorderly. Thank you.